Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt, joins us from Washington as part of the One America in the 21st Century, the President's Initiative on Race. Earlier this morning, Secretary Babbitt dedicated the Wilson Bruce Evans House over on Vine Street, which many of you know, and proclaimed it a National Historic Landmark because of the importance of that house to the Underground Railroad in Oberlin and in Ohio throughout the United States. Secretary Babbitt is a strong advocate of Native American causes and conservation, and as governor of the state of Arizona from 1977 to 1987, he forged a reputation as an able policymaker and a successful mediator. Secretary Babbitt's life of public service also includes 2 years as Arizona's Attorney General from 1975 to 1977. Prior to taking his post as Secretary of the Interior in President Clinton's cabinet, he was a partner in the Washington law firm of Steptoe and Johnson, and in 1988, as you will remember, he was a candidate for the Democratic Party nomination for the President of the United States. Oberlin Professor of Religion and Nord Faculty Fellow Albert G. Miller, who is here on my left, has taught at Oberlin since 1991. He's a specialist in American religion and is currently at work on several studies of evangelicalism and the African American community. Salina Kirk, to my right, is a sophomore at Oberlin. She's a Bonner Scholar majoring in neuroscience and studio art, who is taking part in the discussion series here on campus, Honest Conversations, a series created to promote open and civil discourse about race relations on our campus and in our communities. Andrew LaVallee, directly to Salina's right, is a senior at Oberlin. He's completing an independent interdisciplinary major in English and Ethnic Studies. On campus, he's been active with campus organizations such as the Asian American Alliance, the Organization for Students of Multiple Ethnicities, and the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Union. Oberlin senior Melody Waller is also an Honest Conversations participant. She majors in English with a specialization in African American literature and works very hard and effectively for Oberlin's admissions office. She's a journalist and a staffer of our student newspaper, the Oberlin Review, and was instrumental in putting together the very successful campus conference this past weekend on diversity in journalism. A published poet, she co-chairs Nia Poetic, an African American poetry magazine. I also want to extend a warm welcome to our audience. Mr. Kurt Russell, history teacher at Oberlin High School in his class on African American history, Oberlin professor Adrienne Lash Jones, and students in her class on African American history since 1865, and Oberlin faculty member Benson Tong, and his students in his colloquium on Asian American history. Thanks a lot for joining us today. A brief word about how we're going to proceed. Our dialogue will last approximately 30 minutes, and we'll begin by some remarks and questions or comments by Secretary Babbitt and our Oberlin students. And I will close the discussion, after which we will take questions from the students in the 3 history classes. The question and answer session will last about 25 minutes, and at that point our program will conclude. I also invite you to remain afterward to view the items exhibited in the display cases that have been pulled together by our college archivist, Roland Bauman. These are documents and artifacts that help illustrate the critical role Oberlin played in the abolitionist movement. I want to thank Roland for preparing this exhibit and for making the Goodrich Room available for this conversation. Secretary Babbitt, welcome.
President, I thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to join all of you here. I'm going to be very brief. I want to simply recite a personal experience and say a few words just briefly about what I think is the importance of the President's desire to engage a national dialogue on issues of race. I awakened to these issues in the spring of 1965 when, after watching the incredible days leading up to Bloody Sunday in Selma, I was a student in Massachusetts at the time, I finally just spontaneously picked up and left school and went to Selma, where I participated in the events that led up to the March on Montgomery. I was so moved by all of these events that I subsequently spent 2 years in the South in the civil rights movement before returning finally to my home of Arizona. It was, every time I start reminiscing about these events, my two sons, who are both college students, bring me up short by making this observation. They say, Dad, you know, you got to remember that was a very simple time. The lines were clearly drawn. The issue was legal barriers to equality of opportunity, and it was, you know, sort of very clearly drawn. The issue was voting rights, the Civil Rights Law of 1964, striking down the legal barriers. Today, we live in a much more complex and difficult environment in the quest for racial justice, because the issues now are woven into the fabric of our culture in the form of attitudes, lack of economic opportunity, educational issues, job opportunities. And it's precisely for this reason that President Clinton has made such an effort to put together and jumpstart a national dialogue, focusing on clear communication, definition of attitudes and barriers, recognizing that the next revolution in civil rights cannot exclusively be led by Washington, cannot be driven by legislation. It has to come from a much more complex and enduring source, which is attitudes in the hearts and minds of all Americans. And that, of course, brings me to Oberlin. I had first choice of college campuses to come to as the president sent his cabinet members out this week, and there wasn't any hesitation on my part. I wanted to come here precisely because of the extraordinary history of this community. And I wanted to come here not just to learn about history, but to listen to you and your views of what it is we are doing today. I want to hear about honest conversations and everything else that's on your mind, because it is my suspicion that if we're going to really start some new pathways, they're more likely to emerge, or as likely to emerge here as anywhere else in this country.
Thank you. Would you like to maybe one of the participants in Honest Conversations could talk a little bit about that program and what its purpose is and what's happening in it here on campus?
Okay, Honest Conversations is a campus dialogue, but I suppose it's 3 separate groups on campus, and it was founded out of the chaplain's office, and I think it was helped by the student union. And the purpose is to have basically honest conversations with students about race, about racism, about discrimination, about reverse discrimination if there is such a thing, and just to get issues out on the table and not have to hold your tongue about certain issues. And certain things do come out in the conversation that probably wouldn't come out in regular academic environments. So that's what the Honest Conversations is.
Salina?
What?
Oh. Anything you'd like to add?
No.
Oh, okay. Secretary Babbitt, do you have any questions specifically about how campuses these days are dealing with issues of race relations? Or
Well, what I'd be interested in hearing from the audience or anybody is, what is your perception in this community of the kinds of problems that you're talking about? Are there policies, kind of cultural policies embedded in all this? Is it individual attitudes? Is it a few rednecks from my part of the country who have shown up as students at Oberlin? Obviously, I say that tongue in cheek, but maybe I shouldn't. What is your perception of the barriers? Now, I perhaps have some appreciation of what's happening in the outside world in statistics and all that. But what about here in this community? You all get along? Is this the utopian community that I keep reading about?
I would have to say definitely not.
Okay.
I think,
okay, why not?
as far as the institution of Oberlin, I think Oberlin is very progressive in its attempts to disassociate or just tear down issues of race and racism. But I think as far as Oberlin's stance on the history of Oberlin College, I believe that Oberlin rests upon that. And it's very important that Oberlin was the first institution to admit blacks and the first institution to admit women, and that's something that's very historic and we should all be proud of. However, since then, I think there should be an attempt to recognize that historic improvements are lacking.
Could I ask
and as
you
far as individual, I think it's a mixture of everything you said, individual, institutional, ideologies.
Is this experience, you're in what year?
I'm a senior.
You're a senior. How's your experience here different from your experience as a high school student?
My experience as a high school student was, I'll also say it was younger. I was younger, and issues of race were not addressed at all. So I suppose in Oberlin College they are addressed, but they're addressed very PC.
No, what do you mean by very PC?
Very politically correct.
No, I understand. Yeah, well,
it's a very polite way. Most in the academics, it's a very polite way of saying or admitting to personal racism or somewhat institutionalized racism. It's very. I heard yesterday that racism has a very polite face, and I thought that was very interesting.
Wow. Okay. Anybody else?
Sure. I come to Oberlin College from public schools in Mobile, Alabama, and so I guess the way that I saw it when I first came to the Midwest is a geographical difference, where my personal experience with race and or racism was more virulent in the South, but as I've come to understand the way things work here, I would agree with what Melody said, especially in a middle-class institution like Oberlin College. I think that the way that people talk about race and the way that racism comes up does tend to be more politically correct. And it also becomes a way, like you were saying, of thinking about other people's experiences with racism as being more targeted at rednecks or people that don't really understand the way that that the U.S. works now, which I don't think is entirely accurate. I think that racism happens in a lot of different ways, and the way it comes up here is very different than how it might come up in an institution or place where people don't have the same access or educational privileges.
Okay. What about your curriculum here? Is it do you deal with these issues pretty seamlessly through all of your curriculum?
I would have to say that definitely there are token classes that address specific issues on race.
Token classes.
Token classes that are created to talk about race or issues of race come up.
But you don't necessarily see that in the mainstream courses? You don't see it in mathematics, huh?
I'm not a mathematics major.
Okay. You don't see it in history?
I think a lot of the content on race depends on the individual faculty members and the students who make up the classes. There are a lot of classes that do address issues of race. And a lot of them have come to Oberlin or are still on their way here through a lot of struggle, such as African American studies. And students have been pushing for Chicano studies and Asian American studies for over 20 years now. Those things still have not become actualized at Oberlin in any sort of permanent way.
What do they tell you in response to your petitions?
Well, it's difficult because there are sort of, it's difficult to get permanence with faculty and curriculum, and so temporary changes are proposed or things are delayed and that sort of thing.
Secretary? Yeah. I think that I want to pick up on this comment. I think we, many of us at Oberlin have a fear of what we might call Balkanization. That fear comes out when we talk about the need for instance, Asian American studies or Latino studies or other courses, or it comes out in ways when we talk about how students live on campus. We have several residential halls that are connected to are called program houses. One in particular, I think, is part of the symbol of that is African Heritage House, which is designed to promote African and African American heritage on campus. It is connected to the African American Studies program, and it is done in such a way to promote educationally. Now, many of the students that live there are African American, but that's not exclusively so, nor has it ever been. And it has always been a forum and a place where others can come and participate and learn. But if you talk with some members of the Oberlin College community, you would get a sense that this is kind of an exclusively black place. And I think that there are lots of people, or some people on campus, who are very afraid to speak honestly about their fears of what they consider as Balkanization, where groups will only talk to themselves, and I think in this case it's black folk only talking to black folk, as if black students don't interact with white students in classes and in the cafeterias and in other places throughout the campus, and that there's somehow that creates some kind of a notion of separatism on the campus. I think that's a real issue that needs to be addressed and to be looked at and to be discussed in an open and clear way. We just went through a whole discussion on long-range planning, and one of the things that really came out clearly was this overwhelming concern about, quotes, Balkanization, to the point that some were even advocating to close down these houses, these program houses, as a part of the discussion. Thank God that did not happen. But I think it's a lack of education at one level, but I think there's also a kind of fear at another level, very deep-seated in the culture, not only at Oberlin, but I think it's across the country.
Well, that's a fascinating issue. Anybody want to? I'd love to hear from anybody here or anyone who wants to would like to state the opposition case to sort of what should I say? Ethnic studies-based housing, would that be a correct way of, is that the right label?
You might call it that.
Okay. Anybody want to state the case? You know, I guess the issue is, what you're saying effectively is, this is an approach. I see it on increasingly on every college campus in the country. The case that I hear is that, look, there are benefits and drawbacks, but we ought to live in a diverse kind of quasi-market environment in which student demand kind of drives the rise and fall of these kinds of housing arrangements. Is that PC? Is it right? Is there a different way to go about it?
Melody?
I can definitely address the argument, but I can also address the reason why the argument should not be there. The argument is that African Heritage House, not just African Heritage House, because there are other program houses. It's just the African Heritage House always gets addressed. That's also a very interesting comment. But there are other program houses, Third World House. There are language houses, Spanish house, that are never in this argument. The problem is that some students and maybe some administrators and faculty feel that by having these houses, that these communities are segregating themselves and are not allowing themselves to assimilate into the larger Oberlin community. The counter to that is that some members in this community need to have a home base. Like when you go home at night, you need to have a home base. You need to have a center where your issues will be addressed and you won't have to be so PC about everything. And like your culture can be, you can be immersed in your own culture without having to either explain everything that goes on, or you can just celebrate your own culture. I lived in African Heritage House for 4 years. If I stayed here for 2 years, I'd live there for 2 more years, but I'm not staying.
She's graduating.
Graduating. 25th.
I think if I could just address that for a moment, Melody has pointed to a distinction which I've rarely heard. It's an important one, and I've heard people talk about it before, but I don't think I've really reflected upon it before, which is a kind of difference between public and private. The notion of home, the notion of having a home base is important, I think, in one way or the other to all of our students, and it's a point that is rarely taken into consideration in these discussions about Balkanization. I think because there is so much cultural anxiety, particularly among white Americans, about the perceived need of people to get to know one another on a campus like this. I do think that students get to know one another on a campus like this, but I also think that in all of our institutions, on campus and off, it is very, very easy. I hear this a lot from our alumni. I'm often asked, how come when you go into an Oberlin dining room, or a dining room on any other campus for that matter, how come you'll see a table with only black students now around it, eating and talking to each other, and it's not an integrated table? It's interesting. I have never heard anybody say, how come you see a lot of tables with just white people around it? Nor have I ever heard this issue come up, particularly with our alumni, and I eat many, many dinners with our alumni. I have never heard this issue come up, but for around a dinner table with all white people around it, which is not seen. It's not salient, I don't think, to white Americans to any significant extent. I do think that the anxieties on this campus and other campuses about Balkanization and segregation reflect some very real and I think well grounded concerns that the most important thing that we can do on our campuses today is to help people in a very diverse, very pluralistic society learn to live together. And that when we look at how American higher education is going to be judged 50, 60, 100 years from now by historians, that's the question, I think, that's going to be asked about colleges and universities in the United States at the end of the 20th century. What did you do, or what didn't you do, to enable people to feel that they are able to gain the arts of living together in a multicultural society? But too often, I think these two factions, if you will, the Balkanization warriors and the people on campus who say it's really important, one, and this is very important, that people get a chance to decide for themselves where they live, and two, what Melody pointed out about the importance of a home base. Too often we talk past one another because so quickly in a dialogue, the anxiety flags go up. And it's, I think with AG, it's an important issue that we actually try to talk through and come up with some sort of understanding, at any rate, of the different positions and the different worries and the different goals that are reflected in there.
Yeah.
I think that it's an interesting discussion that this Balkanization idea. It's always been the case in America. I think that that migrant groups or immigrant groups have segregated themselves in sections of the city. Chinatown, there's been a Greek town, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's never been that much of an issue with European groups that they've been able to communicate with each other and get along in some way, and that this is sort of a unique problem for maybe a couple of groups, especially the African American community, and that for the European communities, what's really allowed them to be successful is when their culture has been absorbed by the American culture rather than an integration thing where the Italians, for example, become more like Americans, that the rest of America becomes more like Italians. And so I'd propose that the same thing needs to happen for African American communities. That rather than African Americans becoming more like the rest of America, although that does need to happen to some extent, that the rest of American culture needs to absorb some of the African American culture. And I'd like to propose that that is in fact happening, especially in the last maybe 15 years or so, with although it's been happening for longer than that with rock and roll, jazz, back a long way, but especially accelerated now with rap music and basketball and all of the celebrities, black celebrities, that the culture is becoming absorbed by the larger American culture, and that I see that as progress, a lot of progress.
It's really an interesting comment. What the most profound experience for me in Selma, Alabama in 1965 was not standing up to the violence and the danger of physical intimidation. The most revealing experience for me was the time that I spent living in the protective presence of an entirely African American community on the other side of the tracks, where, you know, if you went into the white community, you were at risk of injury or death, and that for the first time in my life, I was learning the reality of another culture, and it made, you know, I began to see this ambivalence about a pure integrationist model, which the premise of which is that minority groups of whatever kind should simply, no questions asked, be assimilated, and anything that works against assimilation is automatically suspect. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Benson Tong, faculty with History Department here. I think the question of Balkanization has loomed large in our imagination, not only here but also in the rest of America. And I think the origin or the root of this notion of Balkanization lies in the fact that people are trying or struggling in all walks of life, and they may conceptualize their understanding of this in various different ways, but largely I think it's rooted in this struggle to find the American identity. There is this huge struggle that both historians, scholars, and the American audience of all backgrounds have had to work with over centuries of American history and today in trying to locate the origins or the roots of the American identity. For me personally, as a scholar, as a lay person, speaking in different voices and different locales, I see the search for the American identity as a search for common values and attitudes. And I think one can find that by looking at the multiplicity of cultures. In looking at cultures in many different forms and in many different places and in many different times, one can find, I believe, commonalities of attitudes, thoughts, emotions, and perceptions. I'm reminded of that whenever I deliver a talk about the internment experience for Japanese Americans during World War II, and how I could, to some degree, find a common thread of human interaction between that experience and with that the experience of the removal of American Indians during the 1830s, and also the expulsion of Chinese Americans at the end of the 19th century, and then bring all of this together with the so-called, euphemistically called, repatriation program for Mexican Americans. In locating these points of tensions, we find the humanity in all of us.
I read a book last week, the title of which I think is King Philip's War, The Name of War. Really quite an extraordinary series. Well, it's a book about the first great failure that got the European immigrants off to a totally disastrous start in terms of dealing with Native Americans in the 17th century in colonial New England. Really a very powerful sort of exposition of all of these issues.
Come to the mic.
I think one of the problems, am I talking too loud? No? Okay, I think one of the problems with what is lacking in these conversations about racial reconciliation and sort of what Melody pointed out, the political correctness that so often is the case in campus dialogues on race, is that we focus so much on these commonalities and that we don't focus on actual differences. And Mr. Babbitt talked about living in the African American community and possibly experiencing or being able to recognize some of the differences in life for different groups in America. And I think that's one of the things that we have to recognize in beginning this dialogue is being aware of our social locations and being aware of like the different challenges that different people have had to face. And that needs to be really explicit, I think, from the beginning of any racial dialogue, is recognizing the privileges that, say, white students have at Oberlin, or the privileges that, heterosexual students have, and how, especially when we talk about Balkanization and the different program houses on campus, I feel that fear that Mr. Miller was talking about is often based on an ignorance of those different social locations and those different privileges. I think a lot of students don't recognize that in the absence of program houses, students of color and other students would often be sprinkled like paprika on potatoes, as one of my professors said, all around campus. And I think a lot of white students who protest the Balkanization of this campus don't realize that whether there be Balkanization or not, they will always be in the majority, whatever dorm they live in, unless it's a program house. If this campus didn't have program houses, they would always be in the majority. And so, and us not recognizing the benefits of those program houses, I think a lot of that has to do with not being aware of our privileges on this campus. And I think that needs, again, I just think that needs to be explicit. Any conversation on race right from the beginning is our differences in terms of privilege and other things.
I'd like to, it seems to me that part of what we're dealing with are issues of self-determination. And it's also issues of power and power relationships. That when we begin to talk about issues of race, we have to look at the issues of power dynamics. I also think, in order to kind of at least bring in some of the reality of the high school students that are here, we ask or would like to kind of manufacture a relationship on the campus that is not even in the reality of this community. Let me give you an example. You will notice throughout the city of Oberlin there are scattered site public housing that are scattered throughout certain sections of the city. And you'll find that they're in every section but one, and that is in the west side of this community. The west side is perceived as the wealthier, mostly professors and administrators from the college live there. And that one section does not have, did not share equally as all of the other communities did in terms of the building of scattered site public housing. And that these are the kinds of issues that I think that we have to honestly, if we're going to talk about race in this community, whether it's at the college or in town, we're going to have to honestly look at the policy at policy level and at attitudinal level, why we end up with the kind of public housing. And so we're bringing in intersecting issues of race and class into this discussion, because it has to nexus at some point, because of the kind of powerful way in which those folk who have more privilege own more power in this community and therefore dictate how others shall live. And so there is a connection between how one chooses to live, for instance, on this campus in self-determination, and the inability to define themselves in the larger society, particularly in Oberlin. And I think that these are real honest issues that we have to face as a community in Oberlin.
There's a fascinating example of this class overlay going on right now among Native Americans who, as you know, are distinguished by their explicit desire to live on a communal land base in a communal economy. Everything where you find these land-based tribal economies next to surrounding communities, it doesn't seem to attract a lot of lightning in the form of dissension until such time as the tribes become economically successful, whether through casinos or mineral rights or whatever. And then the tensions, rather than going down as you would expect in a kind of predictive small d democratic kind of model, they often go up precisely for the reasons that you're talking about in terms of the sharing and allocation of not just legal rights but of economic issues.
I wanted to say that I think this conversation is a wonderful idea, and I really appreciate some of the comments that have been made. However, I have one concern, and that is I think that any conversation on race relations has to happen within a context of responsibility, political action, and policy. I think that there's a quote by Bill Clinton in his pamphlet talking about race relations, saying that bettering race relations, money cannot buy it, power cannot compel it, technology cannot create it, it can only come from the human spirit. I feel that's a really way to project responsibility onto these vague ideas of discussion, not take political action, not take a look at policy and how it affects race relations. I think if you look at the record of the Clinton administration, the White House, it's very hypocritical actually to be talking about race in terms of what the Clinton administration has done to attack welfare and imaging of welfare queens, attack affirmative action, support racist prison policies like death penalty and 3 strikes and you're out, racist trade bills like GATT and NAFTA, which encourage the exploitation of darker peoples in the third world. So I was wondering if you could speak to those concerns, the seeming hypocriticalness of them.
Well, okay. Sure. A couple of thoughts. First of all, I think we have to be very careful to not to attribute, sort of racial insensitivity or racial motivations to the entire world of issues. I got to tell you, I don't think NAFTA is a racist issue. NAFTA is an extraordinary, for example, opening toward the Mexican economy, which is producing benefits of real value for our southern neighbors in the context of an unemployment rate which has gone steadily downward since NAFTA was passed. The President spent a week in Africa last week promoting free trade, and I just don't see how you can equate that. There's a lot of opposition to free trade policies based in sort of ideological views of the environment and the functioning of the world economy. But it does not sort of automatically lead to the kinds of conclusions that you suggest. And it's a very seductive thing because we're still laboring under this idea that all progressive policies ought to sort of link up with each other. And to the extent that you view free trade as anti-progressive, these things get all scrambled up. Now, let me just very briefly say this on behalf of the President. His commitment to these issues is, to me, obvious and extraordinary, and not the least of them is what he has done in this government, starting with his cabinet and working all the way down through every level of government in terms of opening it up. The number of African Americans sitting in the President's cabinet right now, there are 14 officially designated cabinet members. Rodney Slater, the head of the Office of Management and Budget, and there are two other African American members of of the President's cabinet. It goes all the way down. I came here today to dedicate a facility administered by the National Park Service. The director of the National Park Service is an African American, first time in history. Not to say that there aren't a lot of unfinished issues. There certainly are.
Andrew?
To respond to what you're saying, I think what a lot of people, or from people that I've talked to, with their objections to these sort of dialogues are that they don't feel like that there is a material commitment from Clinton or the White House on issues of race other than this sort of relatively polite dialogue on race that's happening. And why, to go along with what you said, while I don't feel that legislation is a complete answer in itself to the problems of racism in the U.S., I do feel that laws codify values of Americans. And even though Clinton did not support things such as affirmative action being dismantled, I think it does say something when he so weakly opposes that it happens, or then that he remains silent when basic educational and healthcare access are denied to immigrants, when basically the foundation of this country is based on immigrants who, because they're white, are assimilated and become Americans. When it's darker people, the sort of game changes dramatically. I think that these sort of stances that he takes or doesn't take do have an impact on the way that people of color are viewed as freeloaders in this country, despite the fact that Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans physically and economically constructed the nation that we live in now. So I think that what people are looking for is for actions to follow this. And I know that this discussion is meant as a starting point to further dialogue and further activity, but I also have a lot of concerns that this is sort of the platform for a public relations commercial or that sort of thing, and that the dialogue stops here and that nothing further really happens as a result.
Look, those are fair concerns, and obviously there has to be a continuum from dialogue, which is an essential beginning point, because, as you point out, actions must follow in a political process from public support, which is generated only in the first instance by the soft part of the political process. Now, the President did very eloquently and vigorously oppose the affirmative action ballot initiative in California, and he has done that consistently on all of those related issues. Why is the President advocating expanded education, college tuition credits, expanded student aid, and all of those issues? Well, they're intimately tied up with widening the doors of opportunity. They are all, for the most part, means-tested initiatives, which means that they are being targeted precisely at the issues of poverty, which are so intimately wrapped up in the fabric of discrimination. This is not exactly a time in which there is pervasive public support for large changes. We learned that lesson with the President's Health Care Initiative in 1993, which was truly comprehensive. I can't fault us for not trying. Now, the health care initiatives these days tend to be focused on children. They tend to be means-tested. That means we are looking right at children in poverty, which is an area. Why do that? Because it commands the kind of political support that's necessary to get it done in Congress.
I have a personal story to relate. I'm from Lorraine, and a couple years ago, my younger brother, who was about 17, came to visit my sister, who was living in Barrows, freshman dorm. Some of her friends who were college students were going to play basketball at the gym, and they invited my brother. So they're playing basketball. There's a couple of guys that are from the town, and they're also playing, so they start up a game. One of the guys does something, and my brother says it's an illegal move, whatever. They get into some kind of argument about it. Then the other guy starts shoving, and the next thing you know, it's a fight, and my brother punched him, but he didn't throw the first punch. He did not start the fight. And the other guy, it like fractured his jaw or something. And so my brother, after that, they leave the gym, they come back, don't even tell me anything about this. They're just like trying to avoid security and stuff. Well, of course, security picks them up. They get taken down to the police station. The other kid's family is there. And for some reason, even though the other guy was 19 and my brother was 17, the other guy started the fight and there were witnesses. My brother got 1.5 years in the juvenile prison and the other guy got nothing. So, any responses to that? I mean, that's the kind of stuff I'm dealing with that is distracting me from school and everything else.
Good afternoon, Mr. Babbitt. I find it very encouraging that the President is trying to reach out to the public with the race initiative, but to do so successfully, he has to present a very solid, consistent message on race. And it is very critical that he addresses issues that are economic issues and crime issues that I feel are disproportionately affecting minorities. Case in point, the unemployment rate is for African American males, I believe, is almost double the rate for that of white Americans, and his support for such things as being tough on crime, for penal institutions, and for the death penalty, that is racist in effect because it is disproportionately affects minorities, blacks and Latinos. It is very important that the Clinton administration does not go back on its words, that it follows its words with solid actions. Otherwise, minorities will very likely look for other political alternatives. Ross Perot's third party is just a beginning of alternative parties that are growing in strength. The United States Labor Party, one of its pledges is to eradicate racism with a socialist alternative. If the Clinton administration wants its racial initiative to work and to appear legitimate, it must create a very solid front with actions to follow its words and to ring true.
I'm going to ask Secretary Babbitt to respond to the last few comments, and then give any remarks you'd like to kind of finish off our discussion this morning, and then I'm going to close the session. But I want to thank everybody for taking part.
Okay, just I was going to suggest that we try to get into the crime issue, because it is extraordinarily important for all groups and all individuals, and it is one that we must find ways to disentangle the different strands. Now, see, I heard two different things here. Here I heard a case which, obviously on the facts as you state them, a clear, undeniable miscarriage of justice. Is that your point? Mm-hmm. And it happens all too often. And we must find some way into that. Now, but what you're saying, I think, may be a little too facile, and that is that the statistics themselves are unequivocal evidence of racism. Now, the statistics may in fact be, or certainly are, unequivocal indicators of the social and socioeconomic conditions, which are surely in large measure a byproduct of racial attitudes. But the question then becomes, what's the approach you take? And it seems to me that it's a little, I'm not clear how you get from that to the suggestion that the President's efforts to improve the criminal justice and improve it even to the extent of upping the apprehension and arrest rate is misguided. So I guess what I want to end on is just a question that we should all be thinking about, and that is, how do we deal with injustice as applied to individuals without falling into the trap, which we did to some degree in the 60s, of backing off from the criminal justice system writ large? It's a very complicated and I think a very urgent question.
I'm going to take one more question from Mr. Russell, our high school history teacher here in Oberlin.
Thank you. I appreciate your invitation, first of all. Few comments I'd like to make. First of all, I am an African-American history teacher at Oberlin High School, and this is my second year teaching. And there's a few problems with that, as Ms. Melody mentioned earlier about token classes. And I'd like to talk about token classes and how can we build bridges between the races. African-American history class consists of 21 students this year, and we have one white student. And I believe white students at Oberlin High School believe that black studies is not related to them, and that black studies has no relevance to their own culture. And from that standpoint, we have white students at Oberlin High School who choose not to take the class. I'm not sure what the reason is. From the standpoint, it could be personal reasons, but they choose not to take African-American history. Black students live black experience. They've been there, they live every day. White students do not. And from that standpoint, white students need to appreciate, or more or less take courses that is directly related to black culture, black experience, black heritage, the whole realm, the African diaspora. It's also important for black students to take courses that is relevant to white history, to Asian history, to women history, to any ethnic group. And once we understand that courses with names, African, Asian studies, Native American studies, as long as we recognize that each course is relevant to their own personal experience, their own personal growth, then we can start building bridges between the cultures and the races. The cultures and the races. And that's what I try to do in my class, too, is to speak upon experience that is related to them personally. And I believe that this is good to have a meeting like this, a forum. However, what are we going to do once we leave here? Are we going to go our separate ways? Or are we going to have more discussion about it? And my class know that each day, each Friday, we talk about current issues. And we talk about race issues because it's important. And once we talk about that, and the classroom is a great venue to discuss this. And once we discuss this, each and every day, each week, on the hour, then it's possible for us to come together as one. But if we don't do this, and we take Mr. Babbitt, he's going away today, so he's not going to be here tomorrow. And this panel is not going to be here tomorrow, class. And so what are we going to do when they leave? Okay? And so that's what Oberlin High School needs to do. That's what Oberlin College needs to do. Each day, talk about the issues. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Very eloquent. Thank you. Very eloquent.
Thank you very much for coming today. It is past the time, actually, that we're supposed to wrap up, and I want to thank Secretary Babbitt for coming to Oberlin, to our community, and to our college this morning. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for coming and for taking part. Great.